down those cards.
Fortune teller!
Cards mean different things at different times.
Do you know anything about tarot cards?
Oh, a crystal ball.
Gather around, children.
Listen to the mystic.
Journey.
Podcast.
I'm no mystic.
Welcome to the Mystic Bull's Journey podcast. I'm Anna, and this is Ruth. Hi. This is an occult history podcast, and today we're taking a deep dive into the history of pet psychics. Let's dive in.
I'm so excited to talk about pet psychics. You don't even know.
I'm excited to hear you talk about pet psychics because this wasn't even like a thought in my brain. This was nowhere on the radar for me.
I know. It was one of those like 4 a.m. wake ups, and it was just in my brain like, we have to talk about pet psychics. Like, there's so much to it. I want to know how we ended up getting into this. I want to know where the scams are, where the truth of it is, because there's always a little bit of truth in the scam, you know?
Oh, yeah. It starts somewhere. It's usually somebody being like, yeah, this is a good idea and trying to use it for good. And then someone's like, but how can we monetize it?
Absolutely.
That's where it gets rough.
And one thing that I thought would be interesting for this topic for the both of us, which you have since debunked, which was surprising to me, I thought it would be a great topic for us because I thought we both would be on the same page of how into this subject we are. But it sounds like you're pretty like still in the skeptic side and I'm on the believer side, which is different for us.
This is a interesting one. I am pretty skeptical of it. And maybe I'll give it some room. Maybe it's because of how humans are portraying the psychic stuff. And I think we'll kind of get into like why I'm skeptical, but also the areas where I think I overlap and like agree. And, you know, maybe it's like the marketing of it all, you know, like the way it's just like broadly understood in culture. Maybe that's where I'm like, oh, that feels weird. You know, well, let's just dive in because like at this point, I'm just talking around the subject.
Yeah, there's a huge umbrella for the type of people that are in tune with animals. But today we're going to keep it siloed to people who say they use a combination of clairvoyance and telepathy to communicate with animals.
Yep, we went over this. I'm not going to lie. I'm still the topic. Yeah, because I think this is where it starts to get dicey is there's a spectrum. And there's parts of the spectrum where I'm like, yes, definitely communicating with animals. And there's another part of the spectrum where I'm like, that seems like a stretch.
Yeah, absolutely. The spectrum is broad. So humans have a rich history of indigenous legends, folklore, and witchcraft myths that are chock full of animals that can talk and people that can talk to animals. And there's plenty of pop culture interpretations of communicating with animals as well, like Tarzan talking to animals, as well as Dr. Dolittle, the wild thornberries, and of course, you know about witches and their familiars, which is a topic we've since decided that we will cover in a future episode.
Heck yeah, that one has to be a deep dive. Like, I feel like that's a great one to go into.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a bunch of wacky, crazy stories about all that.
Oh, heck yeah.
And literally anybody can communicate with animals, obviously. Animals are very in tune with the sound of our voices and our mannerisms. But many people believe that this actually goes a step further. In 2015, a British magazine took a poll and found that 40% of Brits think that their pet is psychic. And to be fair, this definitely wasn't an unbiased poll, but still kind of a fun fact.
So, like, I wanted to go back because I had to, like, read that sentence a few times and like listen to it again. I was like, okay, let's just make it clear. The owners think the pet is psychic. They don't think they're psychic or that they even are mutually psychic. Like the pet is doing the heavy lifting in this belief where it's like, all right, it's the pet. It's not me.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like, it's that codependent nature that we've put into our pet relationships nowadays where it's like, my pet's my support system. It knows what I'm thinking. It knows when I'm sad and comes cuddles. When really it's just like it knows that it can get cuddles whenever and it probably just wants. It's like, more of coincidence than it is in tuneness, but whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. I also like did a little search. Like once you said that there was like this poll from 2015, there's been a lot of other polls that are even more recent. And even not, and like when you said this stat, I was looking at, I was like, wait, but these polls, I did a quick search and there was one from like 2022 and it was like 80% of Brits think that their pet is psychic. And I was like, okay, that's a lot. The sample size of people is a little like dicey. It was like only 1,000 people. So it's not super representative of the population. So it makes the percentages sound like really impressive.
Yeah, it's like Pet Psychics Magazine Daily did a poll. It's just like such a pointed poll where it's like it's not really a true fact, or an accurate representation, but it's still fun.
Yeah, you know that like if Pet Psychics Daily, quote unquote, is doing the actual poll, they're probably just polling people who already believe in pet psychics. They're not doing like, let's find some randos on the street and see who actually does.
Exactly.
But there was like this one survey that I was reading into where a good chunk of people, they get deep into some of these questions. They said that the pet owners let their dogs make decisions for them. And I was like, okay, tell me more, because it was like, cool, we start out low key. We think our dogs are psychic. I'm like, all right, carry on. It's like, well, we let them make decisions for us. I was like, okay, well, like what kind of decisions? And it started out pretty like benign. It's like, oh, we let them decide which way to go on the walk. I'm like, well, okay, of course you're going to let your dog like go down the left path instead of the right path or whatever. Or like you're going to let them bark at the type of food that they want. Like those are some of the things. But then it got weirder because some of these people were letting dogs decide if they should buy a home. Like which home. Like they were letting them pick which home to buy. Or they were letting them decide if they should forgive someone.
What?
Yeah, like, hey, I'm mad at Ruth. Should I forgive her? I don't know how this went. Most pet owners said that they usually used barking or like a paw. Like if the dog would paw at them, would be their signal for like, oh, this is like them picking something. And I'm like, forgiving someone seems like a real big deal for a dog to decide.
Yeah, I imagine in my head it's like similar to like when they say your dog always knows who the bad guy is and they wouldn't stop barking at this guy. I imagine it's similar to that. And I also understand like, you know, letting your pet into the major decisions because they really are a member of the family unless you're treating them like a farm animal, which is valid. You know, they should have some sort of a say or at least be around when you're making the decision. Take them into account.
Yeah, for sure. I think we all I do, and I know you do.
Absolutely.
Take your pets into account, like if you're changing apartments, moving to houses, or something like that. You're kind of like, I gotta make sure like there's space for my pet, there's a place for them, they're gonna like it. But you know, forgiving people's that's a stretch for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely.
But like regardless of which poll we're looking at, I think it's pretty safe to say most people have met someone who talks about having a strong bond with their pet. Whether or not they use the word psychic is a different experience. So that's a big spectrum that we're kind of here to explore a little bit.
Yeah, big spectrum and lots of different words and names and titles for this sort of thing. So we'll use them all interchangeably. And the rise of pet psychics, I think, is pretty closely linked to the rise in New Age spiritualism and animal welfare rights.
Yeah, and I'm like kind of, I can't speak to like our modern understanding of pet telepathy, but obviously because it's not was not the topic that I knew we were going to do. I was very excited to hear it. But throughout history, there have been cultures and religions all over the world on both sides of what I'm just going to call like animal sentience or like animal autonomy spectrum. So like on one end, we have the cultures that viewed animals as incredibly inferior to humans and, you know, would use them for things like brutal entertainment in the Colosseum, you know, horrible things where they're just like, well, they're less than us, so we can treat them however we want. Then you kind of have that middle area of cultures that, of course, hunted animals for food because we needed to survive, but they still fully respected the animal's nature and its sacrifice for their survival. You know, they would give thanks, they'd have rituals. But there are even some ancient Eastern cultures that trended towards vegetarianism because they believed we shouldn't be killing any living being. So even before PETA existed, we've had cultures that are like, no, we recognize the sanctity of life and we're not going to touch animals because, you know, we think they're reincarnated ancestors or they are representative of our gods or just the fact that they are a living being, we shouldn't be eating them. So like veganism and vegetarianism has been around for a long time. That is not new.
Yeah, definitely not new. And it's just so crazy how different the world is on this subject. It feels like, if anything, we should be fairly aligned in all cultures on how we treat animals, but like it's just surprising to me that we're not.
Yeah, it's upsetting to me is the word I would use.
Sure.
that we're not aligned. But yeah, I think like it comes down when you look at any religions, particular like dogma and how if they tell you how to treat people in a certain way, like you can tell that would extend to like animals. So if there's like a hierarchy of people, like men are better than women, then like you can imagine that the chain is just going to keep going down and like animals are below humans. But it's unsurprising to me that like pet psychics have become a thing because we're in this super interesting time where we have access to information about ancient cultures and their reverence for animals mixed with science, actual science that's like coming out, making discoveries about how animals communicate and learn. You know, we have scientists that are trying to figure out consciousness and self-awareness and whether or not animals have that. And then we have this like new-ish reality that we no longer need pets as much for a function. So like, you know, we bred dogs to help us hunt, to keep us safe. But now that we're living in this time where we don't need that as much, like wolves aren't going to come in and eat our chickens, so we don't need the dog to watch them at night. Like we can now look at our pets and perceive them in a new way. We kind of can start trending more towards they're a part of the family. They're just like my sibling or, you know, fur babies. So now that we have more security than we ever did when we were living in tribes, it like frees up that headspace to like perceive pets as this like, you know, nuanced being, you know, which we probably always should have been doing. But now that we don't need them to like survive, we can be like, cool, you're just like, you know, Susie.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting how we've evolved in that realm of pet ownership, especially with the emergence of like just pets as like an economy in general.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I forget what the stat is. I also read a stat while I was looking into this where it's like we spend like $7 billion a year on our pets.
It's a
like,
lot.
Yeah, it goes up and it like triples every year. It's crazy numbers of how much money we're spending on our pets.
Oh, yeah. I think I remember it wasn't that long. It was like a few years ago, you know, all the headlines that were like, millennials are killing this industry. And at one point, it was like, millennials are killing the pet food industry. And it wasn't that we were killing it. It's that we were actually like looking into what we were feeding our pets.
Yeah. Isn't that wild?
Yeah. So we were demanding higher quality food because we're like, well, we're all living beings. And if I'm not going to eat the shitty ground up meat, why would I serve it to my pet? You know, we were.
Yeah. And not even meat, mostly just corn for dogs a lot of the time. It's just like corn filler. Like,
yeah.
And that's definitely, you know, where I start to rally behind this whole thing.
Oh,
because I don't want to be eating the same thing every day. And I definitely don't want to be eating corn every day. And so I always try to diversify. I get my dogs those little ice cream cups.
Oh, I love those. Yeah, those are so cute.
Yeah, they're so fun.
Yeah, I definitely tend to get like a higher quality food for my cat, and I usually try to get the ones that have various types of meat in it, and I will literally stack the cans so that way I remember like, oh, they ate this one yesterday, so they get
fun.
this. So I can tell. I like stack them so they're like what's the word I'm looking for? Anyways,
diversified,
whatever it is, alternating. So there it is.
There we go.
Yeah. So okay, pet psychic seems to be kind of recent. When did this start? How did you start diving into this?
Yeah, okay. So I just assumed because we've done this whole rigmarole with, you know, these occult esoteric topics enough. I assumed when I started digging into this topic that I'd find the roots in either ancient Egypt or at the very least like 1800s England during like the spiritualist movement. My thinking was like both of these cultures had one leg in each half of this niche. And both of those cultures are what we most commonly refer back to when we talk about like, you know, woo-woo topics. Ancient Egypt, of course, had a rich tradition of associating animals with various deities, symbolism, and rituals, and animals held great significance in ancient Egypt religion, mythology, and daily life. And they were often seen as symbols of specific deities or were believed to have connections to the spiritual world. Some animals were considered sacred and were venerated, while others were associated with specific qualities or attributes. So all that's why I figured, like, obviously ancient Egypt would have some hand in the origins of animal communication. Like, there's going to be one dude who's besties with, like, Cleopatra, and he's just chatting with the hairless cat deity all day. But there's actually no historical record or evidence of individuals during this time period who are specifically identified as animal communicators in the way we understand the term today.
Yeah, I would have also started there, and I'm actually a little surprised that nothing came up. Just because of all the reasons you said, like this culture revered animals. Lots of ancient cultures did. Like, they took them as spirit guides, or they saw them as actual deities. They wouldn't eat them in some cultures because they saw them as gods or as reincarnations. But the more I thought about this, and this is purely hypothesis, if a culture believed and practiced communication with animals in the way that modern pet psychics do, animal communicators do, okay, they would 100% not be mummifying or sacrificing animals, which is something that cultures did. Because when I started to think about it, could you imagine how horrible it would be to hear little Fluffy, little Fido going hey, what are we doing? Why are you so nervous? What's that big, sharp, shiny stick you're holding? What do you mean it's not a toy? What do you mean we're not going out today? What are we doing in this weird temple with flames? If you're hearing that all while you're trying to sacrifice this poor babe to your gods, I don't think humans would have continued to do that. I feel like that would have been cut off pretty quick. You'd have to be a pretty cold-hearted to be an animal communicator and then also sacrifice them. You're I can hear their thoughts. This is horrible. Ew. Ugh.
Yeah, isn't that the first step for serial killers?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's sociopaths. That's also a watch out for potential abusers, is if they're willing to kick your animals and be mean to animals. So
yeah,
know that.
Absolutely.
That's a red flag.
And I figured it's got to be some priest that is communing to God through an animal, but there's at least no written historical record.
Nope. Yeah, not in the way that we understand it. There's definitely people who read their entrails, which I think we kind of touched on.
Absolutely. Could we consider that to be an animal communicator?
I think if you're killing the animal,
yeah.
I think the thing is they're using the animal basically as a low-tech telephone to talk to God.
Right.
So it's not quite the same.
That's very true.
Well, after that, I do have a random fact as a palate cleanser.
Oh, yeah, we could use that palate cleanser.
Yeah. So you mentioned hairless cats when talking about Egypt because, that particular breed is often called a Sphinx cat. They weren't actually bred until the 1960s.
Oh.
Yeah, so technically it's a Canadian Sphinx cat because it was bred in Canada.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. It's we constantly in pop culture use the hairless cat alongside Egyptian imagery and iconography when we're mentioning things, and it's those cats probably could not exist in Egypt given the sun and the lack of their fur. But anyways, Canada.
Should we do a origins of the hairless cat?
Origins of the hairless
to
cat.
Debunk. I feel like I have some beliefs about hairless cats that I need to question now.
Yep, it was just probably a fun marketing thing.
Yeah, you know what? Now that I do think about it, what you're saying makes sense. I always thought it makes sense for them to be hairless cats in Egypt. It's too hot for them to have fur. But really, the fur is protecting them from the sun. So
yeah, it's their
that
SPF.
Makes sense.
Yeah, if you ever decide to own a hairless cat, you do have to put sunscreen on them when they go outside because they're just like us. They're just like us. They need protection.
That's so funny, man. What the heck?
So Egypt didn't pan out for finding references to pet psychics. Where do you look next?
So after finding out Egypt wasn't it, I was like, cool, it's got to be the 1800s England because, spiritualism is taking off. We've literally got mediums every which way coming out of the woodwork. And so it only makes sense that someone from this time period would claim that they could telepathically speak to animals. It makes sense. And don't get me wrong, there were definitely individuals who claimed to have the ability to communicate with animals, often in the context of animal magnetism, spiritualism, and other paranormal or metaphysical practices of the time. But they operated in a very broad context and did not operate as recognized animal communicators in the modern sense. It was very broad. We're talking siloed animal communicators in this context.
Yeah.
The concept of pet psychics, also known as animal communicators or pet telepathists, and like a million other names, began to gain prominence in the latter half of the 20th century, mainly around like 1960s when the term started to pop up. And by the 1980s, pet psychics had really staked a claim and were here to stay. So add pet psychics to the list of things we can thank boomers for.
Perfect. Definitely will. I did not realize. I honestly didn't think it was going to be that recent of like a topic. So that was a little shocking for me when you're like, yeah, it wasn't until like the 60s.
Isn't it crazy?
Yeah.
So basically it all started with this guy named J. Allen Boone. And in 1954, Mr. Boone released a book titled Kinship with All Life, which has been widely regarded as the pet psychic's Bible. In it, he shares how he manages to chat with all sorts of critters. It all began with Strongheart, the famous movie dog. Strongheart was a highly popular and influential German Shepherd dog in the early days of cinema. He was one of the earliest canine film stars, known for his remarkable acting talent and striking appearance. You know all about Strongheart, don't you, Anna?
Yeah, I do now. My first thought was like, did he have anybody like advocating for pet rights on set?
No, absolutely not.
Of course not. Not back then.
It's so funny as I read this story, everybody emphasizes just how beautiful this dog was, and it gets a little weird.
Yeah, they were really, and I'm like, I'm not saying that animals can't be like gorgeous or can't be like, oh wow, hey, he like, look at this beautiful craft of nature, but also like, are you guys okay?
I know. Don't
like,
bring it up every 5 seconds.
I'm like, what is going on in your lives that like, listen, this dog is beautiful. I'm like, he's a handsome dog. He looks like any other good boy if you look up a photo of him.
Exactly. So Strongheart was originally named Etzel von Oringen and was born in 1917 in Germany. He was trained as a police and military dog and served in World War I.
Wow. That is a very good boy. I'm also just trying to imagine you like trying to call out that full name to get him to do it. Etzel von Oringen. And you're like, okay, wow. Maybe just Etsy? Like Etzel.
Yeah. I appreciate the change over to Strongheart later in life. It really would be easier.
Better for his branding too, for the movies.
Truly. In the early 1920s, Strongheart was brought to the United States by his owner and trainer, Lawrence Trimble. Trimble had a vision of making Strongheart a film star, and indeed, he became one of the first canine stars of the silent film era. So Trimble had to go out of town and left Strongheart in the care of his business partner, Jane Muffin. And then I say Murfin, but I was pretty certain that her name was Jane Muffin.
Let's double check. I'm pretty sure it was Jane Murfin.
Yeah, it was Jane Murfin. For some reason this whole week I was like, it's going to be so funny saying Jane Muffin.
Muffin. That would have been way better.
So Trimble had to go out of town and left Strongheart in the care of his business partner, Jane Murfin. And then Mrs. Murfin had to leave town unexpectedly, so she called our friend Boone to take care of Strongheart, which was surprising because Boone had no prior experience with dogs.
I have a feeling that like back then people didn't necessarily stress as much as we do now about like making sure we've got the right pet owner. Like now we've got like Rover, where you can be like, do you have good reviews? Are you gonna like make sure my doggo's okay? I feel like back then they're like, listen, this goes back to like the seeing animals as equals versus not thing, where they're like, listen, this dog is fine. Just make sure he goes out and poops and feed him. Like,
exactly.
The bar was way lower for taking care of
way
a pet.
Lower. So this meeting changed his life, and Boone eventually goes on to develop a deep relationship with Strongheart and becomes one of his animal trainers.
No.
This relationship influences Boone's beliefs about animal consciousness and communication. And from there, he got talking with ants, a skunk family, and even Freddy the Fly.
I would like to hear more about Freddy. I'm so confused about how you would communicate with insects. Like animals, I understand. Right. Insects, they are so like, they're basically like an alien species to me. In terms of when you look at like all of the insects and how weird they are and how like different they are, you're like, wow, what if that had been the dominant life form on this planet instead of like apes and humans?
Yeah,
so, like,
absolutely.
Yeah, communicating with insects. I just don't even know where to start. Like, I understand something about how animals communicate with each other, so that's a great starting point. But insects, man.
Yeah, and like it goes back to the thing where it's like if it's a dog or a cat or, you know, a mammal, it can understand our dialect and our body language.
Yeah.
But insects don't. Like,
No.
there's no fly that, I guess Freddy the Fly was the only one.
Maybe Freddy. Yeah, maybe Freddy. I need to read this book if he goes further into
It's
Freddy
a
the
good
Fly.
book. It's written,
Oh, yeah?
It's 1950s. It's 150 pages. And it's 1950s books are so easy to read. Like,
Yeah.
their language was so first grade level. It's very nice.
Oh, interesting. And now I'm definitely gonna have to read this book just to get a sense of like what the writing style was like in the 50s.
Absolutely. So basically what he's getting at is he had to ditch his preconceived notions and biases about animals. Instead of seeing them as lesser beings, he started treating them as equals and having real conversations with them. It's like he turned the whole talking down thing into talking on the same level thing.
Yep. Okay, that's chill. So I'm all here for this. I'm all for like dismantling this weird hierarchy we've been taught. I think humans have a horrible superiority complex, and it's kind of led us to think that we're above nature or outside of nature, and we're a part of it. Like, you know, we go through cycles, we die. Like, there's nothing that we can do to be outside of nature. So why do we think that we can, like, I don't know, be rude to animals? Why would you be rude to animals? It's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this little section is probably where my belief in pet psychics lies.
Okay.
Like, I think it is, you know, a silly topic, and there's a lot of people that, you know, take it for granted and, you know, use it for bad things. But the whole idea of people being able to communicate telepathically with animals and that whole thing, it just brings a lot of side effects of like treating animals nicely that I'm really into. And I think that's really what sells it for me on the side to put me firmly in the believer camp.
All right.
So honestly, super tame stuff. But this book really created the whole pet psychics market. After this book came out, people really started to push the idea of animal communication, which was a much more practical practice, into the realm of animal telepathy, which included more woo-woo ideas.
Woo. Yeah. Okay. So like heads up, if you actually or literally Google animal communication, you're going to get the scientific side of how animals communicate with each other. So like think like mating dances or like a dog baring their fangs or a cat rubbing its scent on you. So it is like a full study. It's prevalent in ecology. Googling animal communicator, as in the person communicating, is where you're going to start to get that alternate phrase for pet psychic. So yeah, it makes complete sense that like it would start out in this like very grounded practice of like trying to communicate with animals, trying to train dogs or like horses. Just so, you know, it's like, hey, let's understand. We're on the same page. Don't kick me. Don't bite me. That kind of thing. I came across a study about elephants. And we were talking about this just before we started recording, and how elephants can tell the difference between languages. That doesn't mean that they can necessarily like understand each language, but they can tell the difference between dialects of languages. And they distinguish between like male, female, and children's voices. So this study was studying these elephants that lived in Africa, and there were two different groups of people in the area, one that spoke one language, one that spoke another, and they acted completely differently when they heard one language over the other. And that's because they learned over time that the tribe that spoke a very specific language was more likely to be the group that hunted them. And specifically men. Like when they heard female and children's voices, they didn't really care about which language, like which group of people it was coming from. They're like, oh, this is chill. Like these aren't the ones that kill us. But when they started to hear male voices, they would distinguish between languages because that's how they learned like, this is the group that might hurt us versus like the other group was mostly like a farming community. So it's like, these guys are fine. They're just gonna farm. And they also it was interesting. They also did a little test as well where they tried to like voice change the male voices to sound female. So like hit it. Elephants could see right through that.
Really?
Yeah. So they like voice changed the group of men that was typically known for hunting the elephants, that the elephants would like be very defensive around. They voice changed it to try and make that voice sound like a female or to pitch it higher or sound like a kid. Elephants still, they were like, nah, we know. We know that is. They still would like group up and in a defensive stance or like round up the herd. And I was like, this is intense. Like this is like a very like real sense of people trying to study animal communication and how they're learning to adapt to humans and what we do. And they react and respond to us. Obviously, that's like not a pet situation where they're in like a loving environment and everybody's happy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was just like, it's super interesting how it's gotten there because we've also seen people with the dogs and the word buttons.
I know. Isn't that so funny? I tried to get Daisy to do that.
Yeah, I remember. Did any luck? Any luck?
No.
Maybe next time. Maybe next time.
Yeah. The elephant thing is insane. Like truly, we are not the smartest species on the block, man. That's
No,
for
I
sure.
really think that like we fully like stuff like that. I'm so glad stuff like this is coming out simply because I think humans have always taken animals for granted and how much they can do and communicate. And we think that they're not intelligent just because they're not smart like humans are smart. You know, they don't. And it's like, how could you measure that? They're different species. Why would they be smart in the way that we're smart? That makes no sense.
It'll be interesting to find when we're on the bottom of the smartness totem pole.
Yeah, right. It's like we just happen to have thumbs. Like, we just, I don't know. Like we just had like some weird leg up somewhere in the evolutionary chain.
Exactly.
So I'm kind of inching into the camp because like I think that like animals can communicate with us and we can communicate with them. But you know, after Mr. Boone realized that we should respect animals and that bond could help us communicate with them. But like he wasn't the guy pushing the spiritual approach to communication that we're used to. So like was the general public like reading about his experience and expanding on it? Is that kind of what happened?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happened. And his original book was very Christian. Like, I would say like very much on the Christian mysticism camp of things.
Interesting.
So it was spiritual for sure. But it's not necessarily anything that, 1950s people weren't hearing in the pews every Sunday. So it wasn't like I'm sure if you were to take out our biases against Christian religion, you would think it's a little bit woo-woo. But for, 1950s people, it was not very woo-woo. And then, so once he published his book and it gained popularity, people just started expanding on that and taking it away from Christian religion into more mysticism. And this animal communication thing, it's kind of like, it's in the same category as supernatural stuff, technically. And technically does fall under the category of paranormal activity. Oh. It's like they're mixing telepathy and clairvoyance, which are those extrasensory perception things, ESP. And most pet psychics, they talk about it in terms of energy rather than, their communication is energy. They're swapping energy with the animals.
Gotcha.
So pet psychics believe that there's this electromagnetic, omnipresent energy that's all around, all of the time. It's part of the radio spectrum, but it's just the problem is that scientists haven't quite cracked how to spot it. And here's the wild part. These pet psychics claim they can tap into this energy to connect with animals, no matter how far away they are or if they're still kicking. It doesn't matter if they're dead or they're alive. So here's what happens when a pet psychic does their thing. First, they kick back and clear their mind. Then they use their mind power to connect with the animal's energy. It's kind of like a mental handshake. They're just saying, hey.
Bill.
And to get the animal's attention, they picture the critter or mentally shout its name, like saying things like, hey, Fluffy. Or if it's an in-person thing, they might like hold on to the physical items of the animal. And if they want to ask a question, they might beam over a mental image or words, kind of like sending a psychic text, and which kind of just sounds like, sending meditational vibes or something.
Yeah.
Next, they imagine the animal responding, kind of like waiting for a text back. So some say that they see images or a mix of pics and words, and a few even claim the animals use kid-like voices. Actually, a lot. Most pet psychics think that animal voices are kid voices.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder how the pet feels about that. It sounds cute.
That's what I'm saying.
But also, like, is the pet like, nah, man, that's not it.
Feels like a hierarchy thing.
It does.
So whatever answer they get, they're like, got it, and let the animal know that they got the memo. Then they pass on the animal's answers to the owner and fire away some more questions if needed. Sometimes they'll also send messages from the owner to the pet. If there's a behavior prob, they'll visualize the fix instead of dwelling on the issue. And this all seems pretty chill to me. I mean, there's really not much to find a problem with, but some people get hung up because technically there's nothing to prove that this electromagnetic energy actually exists, and animals and humans don't have any sensory organs that people or animals could use to send and receive the energy. So just like super minor things.
Super minor. I'm doing air quotes around minor for our listeners. Super air quotes around minor. Yeah, I can't, I almost think I can't decide if this is more or less complicated than try to teach your pet to use the voice buttons.
Yeah, absolutely. My experience with the voice buttons was Bella just ended up realized if she pushed the button, she got a treat. So it didn't matter what button she pushed. It was less communication and more treats, I think.
Yeah, it was like, oh, I just get rewarded for hitting this thing. It's like a toy. It's a treat dispenser.
But maybe I should use these tactics and try again with her. I could try to sit down and telepathically communicate.
I think that'd be fun. I was to say, why not give it a go? You have both Daisy and Bella, so try and beam some happy vibes to them. See if something changes.
Yeah, there we go. So pet psychics and scientists don't exactly see eye to eye when it comes to animal smarts and self-awareness. Pet psychics, they're all like, animals have their own unique identities, just like us humans. Basically, they think animals know who they are and what's going on around them. Now, scientists, well, they're not totally on board with this idea. They're still scratching their heads over animal consciousness in general. Some critters do things that make scientists think, maybe they're onto something. Like some animals can recognize themselves in a mirror, or they get all emotional when another animal bites the dust. But here's the deal. Scientists haven't nailed down concrete proof that animals are as self-aware as psychics say. So it's still all a bit of a mystery.
Now, I'm no scientist, obviously. But, I do think it's odd that we as humans think that, like, our way of communicating with each other is the only way to measure if a creature's intelligent. I mentioned that already. Or even just worthy of respect. Like, throw intelligence out the window because that means you have to figure out, like, how to define what intelligence is across species. But since things like verbal and body language are our only framework of understanding and judging the world around us, like, we somehow think that that's the best way or the only way. But, on the other hand, that same human lens is what I think some pet psychics can also fall prey to. It's like we communicate in human terms. So I feel like pet psychics, like, are they going to be able to accurately represent what the pet needs? Because from their perspective, like, can we ever truly understand an animal's perspective, even if we can telepathically talk to them? It just feels like, oh, hey, there's like a lot of room for bias, I think. It's kind of like pet psychics are probably going to come in, and if the pet is alive and it's like a training issue, they're just mostly going to try and like push the owner's needs onto the pet, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like there's bias across the board where you're just like, some people think animals are dumb and that's their human bias, but also pet psychics might not even be able to accurately communicate what animals need because of their human bias. I feel like I'm getting in the weeds, but
no, swim in the weeds, get comfortable.
Get comfy. We're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, there's several points to this that are valid, that don't make sense. Like, are humans the utmost awesomeness at, verbal and body language? We obviously think so. And, we think most of the things we do is the best. But also, we have no way of proving that that's not necessarily true. Nor would we really accept that as truth if we did figure it out. And also, these animals we're speaking to rely on us for food, water, shelter, and that sort of thing. Most of the animals that are going through this, we've domesticated. So that kind of offers up the other issue of, like, I don't know if it's consent or what, but they're going to do whatever we want them to do because they get food at the end of it. And that's kind of, the basic need of the situation.
Right.
I think probably, I do think that there probably are some pet psychics, or there is some, other energy in the world that we are unable to tap into, or,
for sure,
are unable to see. And if we were able to tap into that, we probably could communicate with animals. but I think most pet psychics probably have more skills relating to cold reading people, looking at people's environments, their behaviors themselves, and then giving them the answers they want to hear or that they'll accept, rather than skills relating to clairvoyance. I'm sure there probably are people in the world that have skills related to clairvoyance, but I think most people in the pet psychics market probably are more scam artists than they are true believers. But I do wholeheartedly believe that if there were any true pet psychics in the world, then it would have been Steve Irwin.
Oh, 100% agree on Steve. I would, yes. If he was still alive, RIP, and if he had come out and been like, listen, I can talk to animals, I'd be like, yeah, I believe you. Like, yeah,
absolutely.
You're the most trustworthy, man working in this field that I could think of. Like, of course I'm going to believe Steve Irwin.
Absolutely. Well, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. And if you're a fan of the podcast, we need you to do this so we can find new fans. Tell your friends, follow us on all socials. Our handles are Sweet Death Inc. and Mystic Fool Tarot on all platforms. And if you're a pet psychic, write in. Let us know. Tangents at mysticfooltarot.com. Shoot us a DM. Please, we want to talk to you. And, we're on the fence here.
What does it feel like? What's it like? Tell me how. I have
Give
pets.
us more insight.
Yeah.
We want to talk to our pets,
Yeah.
All right. See you later.